The summer of 1907 settled over the Whitaker homestead in Taney County like a benediction wrapped in heat and humidity. The kind of oppressive Missouri weather that made even the oak trees seem to droop with exhaustion, while the cicadas sang their endless hymns from hidden perches in the dogwood and redbud that dotted the rolling hills where generations of Whitakers had carved their living from chert-studded soil and the stubborn determination that marked families who had learned to thrive in the borderlands. Between Arkansas wilderness and civilized Missouri townships, the farmhouse itself stood as testament to that determination, its clapboard siding weathered to the silver gray that marked structures that had survived decades of Ozark storms, while its wide front porch promised the kind of hospitality that had made the Whitaker name synonymous with generous tables and open doors throughout the scattered community of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who had chosen to make their lives in country where the nearest railroad depot lay 20 miles of rough road away from the nearest neighbor who might hear a call for help during the long winter nights when isolation could prove fatal to families who lacked the resources to weather emergencies without outside assistance. But on this particular evening in late June, the isolation that normally characterized life in the Ozark Hills had been temporarily transformed into something approaching festive celebration as neighbors from throughout the region had gathered to witness the wedding of Clara Whitaker to Elias Carter, a union that promised to bind not only two individuals in matrimonial bonds, but also two substantial landholdings whose combined acreage would create one of the largest agricultural enterprises in southern Missouri, while also ensuring that Whitaker wealth would remain within the extended family structure that had governed property relationships in the community since the earliest days of settlement. The preparations for Clara's wedding had consumed the better part of 3 months, transforming the normally quiet homestead into a center of activity that brought seamstresses, carpenters, musicians, and cooks from as far away as Springfield to contribute their skills to creating a celebration worthy of the region's most prosperous farming family. The parlor had been cleared of its everyday furniture and decorated with wildflowers gathered from the meadows that stretched between the house and the creek, where Clara had played as a child, while the dining room had been extended through the opening of folding doors that connected it to the front hall, creating space sufficient to accommodate the 47 guests who had been invited to witness the ceremony and partake of the feast that would follow. Clara herself appeared on this evening as the embodiment of rural beauty, refined by careful attention to the fashions and manners that marked young women whose families possessed both the resources and the social ambition necessary to provide their daughters with accomplishments that extended beyond the practical skills required for successful homemaking in frontier conditions. Her wedding dress, created by the finest seamstress in Forsyth according to patterns that had been copied from illustrations in Godey's Lady's Book, transformed her naturally graceful figure into something approaching ethereal perfection, while her dark hair had been arranged in the elaborate Gibson girl style that fashion demanded of young women who aspired to social prominence within their communities. But those who knew Clara well might have detected beneath her radiant exterior signs of the anxiety that had troubled her sleep during the weeks preceding the wedding. Concerns that seemed inconsistent with the joy that should have characterized a bride's anticipation of marriage to someone who possessed all the qualities that Missouri society might have demanded in a husband for someone of her position and expectations. Her conversations with family members and close friends had been marked by questions about the legal implications of marriage that seemed to reflect understanding of financial matters that extended far beyond the domestic economics that typically occupied young women's attention during the period preceding their transition from daughter to wife. Elias Carter, the young man who would become Clara's husband before the evening celebration concluded, represented everything that the Ozark farming community might have considered ideal in a partner for someone whose inheritance would eventually include substantial agricultural holdings, along with the commercial enterprises that had made the Whitaker family prosperous during the decades of economic expansion that had followed the end of the Civil War. The son of a successful merchant family whose business interests extended throughout southwestern Missouri and into Arkansas, he possessed both the financial resources and the practical knowledge necessary to manage large-scale agricultural operations, while also maintaining the social connections that would enable continued prosperity despite the economic uncertainties that characterized agricultural markets during the early years of the 20th century. His devotion to Clara appeared genuine and profound, manifesting itself in the kind of respectful courtship that had earned approval from her family, while also demonstrating the intellectual compatibility that would be necessary for successful partnership in managing the complex business relationships that sustained large farming operations. His conversations with Clara during their year-long engagement had revealed shared interests in literature, music, and the social questions that were beginning to challenge traditional assumptions about relationships between men and women in rapidly changing American society. While his obvious commitment to treating her as an equal partner rather than simply as domestic helpmate suggested progressive attitudes that were still relatively uncommon among young men in rural communities. But perhaps most significantly, from the perspective of Clara's family, Elias's willingness to take the Whitaker name as his own and to commit himself to maintaining the agricultural enterprises that had been built by previous generations indicated the kind of dedication to family continuity that would ensure preservation of wealth and social position that had required decades of careful management and strategic marriages to accumulate and maintain. His legal agreement to adopt Whitaker family traditions and business practices represented more than simple accommodation to local customs. It constituted formal acceptance of responsibilities that would bind him to the land and community in ways that transcended ordinary marital obligations. The matriarch of the Whitaker family, Clara's grandmother, presided over the evening's festivities with the kind of dignified authority that had enabled her to maintain family prominence throughout the economic and social changes that had transformed the Ozarks during the decades following Reconstruction. Martha Whitaker's presence provided both continuity with the family's historical achievements and assurance that traditions would be preserved despite the inevitable changes that would accompany Clara's marriage and eventual assumption of leadership responsibilities within the family's various enterprises. But those who observed Martha closely during the evening celebration might have noticed that her satisfaction with the proceedings seemed tempered by concerns that she was careful to conceal from guests whose presence required the maintenance of perfect social composure, regardless of any private anxieties that might have troubled her thoughts during the months of preparation that had preceded. This culminating moment in her granddaughter's transition from childhood to adult responsibility, her conversations with family members and trusted neighbors were marked by references to legal matters and business relationships that seemed to extend far beyond the immediate concerns of wedding planning into territories that involved substantial financial stakes and potential complications that could affect the family's continued prosperity. The patriarch of the family, Clara's grandfather Joshua, complemented his wife's social leadership with the kind of stern moral authority that had enabled him to navigate the complex relationships between religious conviction, business success, and community standing that characterized life in regions where Baptist doctrine provided the foundation for both personal conduct and commercial relationships. His reputation for biblical scholarship and his role as lay preacher in the local church had earned him respect that extended throughout the county, while his success in agricultural and commercial enterprises had provided the family with resources necessary to maintain social position and provide educational opportunities for younger generations. Joshua's blessing of Clara's marriage reflected his understanding of the spiritual dimensions of matrimony as both sacred covenant and practical partnership designed to serve God's purposes through the creation of Christian households that would contribute to community welfare, while also advancing family interests that were understood to be consistent with divine will. His wedding homily, delivered with the same authoritative presence that marked his Sunday sermons, emphasized the biblical foundations of proper relationships between husbands and wives, while also acknowledging the specific responsibilities that would characterize Clara and Elias's partnership in managing agricultural enterprises that provided employment and economic stability for numerous families throughout the region. But perhaps most significantly, Joshua's public prayers for the couple's future prosperity and spiritual guidance included references to divine protection that seemed to acknowledge dangers and challenges that exceeded the ordinary risks associated with farming life in frontier conditions. His appeals for heavenly intervention in preserving family wealth and ensuring continued success suggested awareness of threats that required supernatural assistance to overcome, while his emphasis on the importance of maintaining family unity in the face of external pressures indicated recognition that Clara's marriage represented more than simple romantic fulfillment and entered territories where financial and social stakes required careful management to avoid catastrophic consequences. The guests who had gathered to witness Clara's wedding represented the full spectrum of Ozark society, from prosperous landowners whose holdings rivaled those of the Whitakers to tenant farmers whose livelihood depended on maintaining favorable relationships with families who controlled access to land and credit necessary for agricultural success. The presence of these diverse social groups at the same celebration reflected both the democratic ideals that characterized American rural communities and the complex hierarchies of wealth and status that determined actual relationships among individuals whose theoretical equality was modified by practical considerations of economic dependence and social obligation. The musicians who provided entertainment throughout the evening represented the rich tradition of Ozark folk music that had developed through the blending of Scottish, Irish, German, and African musical traditions brought to the region by successive waves of settlement during the 19th century. The fiddle tunes that accompanied dancing in the parlor drew upon melodies that had been preserved through oral tradition across multiple generations of performers, while the gospel hymns that punctuated the evening's festivities reflected the profound religious conviction that provided the foundation for community identity and moral guidance throughout the region. But experienced listeners might have detected in these familiar melodies subtle variations and improvisations that seemed to reflect the musicians' awareness of undercurrents of tension that distinguished this particular celebration from the ordinary wedding festivities that marked transitions from single to married life in rural communities. The minor keys that crept into traditionally major melodies, the hesitations that interrupted the normal flow of familiar tunes, and the occasional discord that suggested instruments slightly out of tune, all contributed to an atmosphere that seemed less purely celebratory than wedding music typically provided. The moment that would transform Clara Whitaker's wedding celebration from joyous community gathering into whispered legend occurred during the serving of the wedding cake. That towering confection of white sugar and butter that had been prepared by the most skilled baker in Forsyth, according to recipes that had been refined through generations of Missouri farm wives who understood that such occasions demanded displays of domestic artistry that would be remembered and discussed throughout the county for years to come. The cake itself stood as testament to the Whitaker family's prosperity and social ambition, its 3 layers decorated with intricate sugar flowers and delicate scrollwork that required skills typically found only in larger cities, where professional confectioners catered to wealthy families whose celebrations could justify such elaborate expenditures of time and resources. Clara had been standing beside Elias at the head table that had been positioned beneath the parlor's largest window, where the kerosene lanterns that provided illumination throughout the house created a warm, golden glow that seemed to transform the everyday clapboard interior into something approaching magical splendor. Her wedding dress, despite the heat that had accumulated throughout the long June day, remained remarkably fresh and elegant, while her demeanor reflected the kind of composed grace that marked young women who had been carefully trained in the social skills necessary for successful management of large households and the complex relationships that characterized rural communities, where family reputation could determine the success or failure of commercial enterprises for generations. But those who observed Clara closely during the cake-cutting ceremony might have detected subtle signs of distraction that seemed inconsistent with the attention that such a significant moment in wedding festivities typically commanded from brides whose joy in their new married status should have made them the radiant center of all celebration activities. Her responses to the congratulations and well wishes that surrounded her seemed slightly delayed, as if her thoughts were occupied with matters that existed beyond the immediate context of wedding celebration. While her occasional glances toward the windows that looked out over the farmstead suggested concerns that extended beyond the boundaries of the parlor, where family and friends had gathered to witness her transformation from daughter to wife. The first indication that something had begun to go wrong with the evening's carefully planned schedule occurred when Clara excused herself from the head table with the explanation that she needed to check on arrangements in the kitchen, where the women who had been hired to manage food service throughout the evening were supposed to be preparing the final courses of the feast that would mark the formal conclusion of wedding festivities. Her departure created only momentary concern among the guests. As such, absences were commonly expected of hostesses who took personal responsibility for ensuring that all aspects of hospitality met the standards that their families' reputations demanded in social situations that would be remembered and evaluated by community members whose opinions could influence future relationships and business opportunities. Elias, whose attention to his bride's welfare had been constant throughout the evening, initially accepted her explanation without question, though his expression suggested awareness that Clara's behavior had begun to exhibit signs of strain that went beyond normal fatigue from the demands of wedding celebration. His conversation with nearby guests continued in the pleasant manner that had characterized his social interaction throughout the evening, but experienced observers might have noticed that his attention seemed divided between his obligations as host and his concern about Clara's apparent unease, with circumstances that should have provided the culmination of months of happy anticipation. The kitchen, when Clara reached it through the narrow hallway that connected the dining areas to the working spaces where food preparation had been conducted throughout the day, presented a scene of organized efficiency that reflected the professional competence of the women who had been hired to manage catering services for an event that involved feeding nearly 50 people according to standards that would satisfy the most demanding expectations of rural Missouri hospitality. But Clara's conversation with the head cook revealed concerns that extended far beyond questions about meal service, involving instead matters related to family business and legal arrangements that seemed inappropriately complex for discussion during wedding celebrations. The conversation that took place between Clara and Mrs. Henderson, the experienced cook who had managed food service for numerous important social events throughout the county, was conducted in tones too low to be overheard by other kitchen workers. but its emotional intensity was evident from the expressions and gestures that marked both participants as individuals dealing with information that carried significant implications for future relationships and arrangements. Mrs. Henderson, whose long association with the Whitaker family had made her privy to confidential matters that were not discussed outside the circle of trusted household staff, appeared to be providing Clara with information that was both urgent and disturbing, while Clara's responses suggested recognition that she was learning about circumstances that could fundamentally alter her understanding of her situation. The conclusion of this private conversation was marked by Clara's apparent decision to leave the kitchen through the back door that opened onto the farmyard, rather than returning to the parlor where her wedding guests were expecting her to resume her role as the celebration's honored center of attention. Her departure from the house was conducted with the kind of deliberate stealth that suggested awareness that her absence would create concern among family members and guests if it were discovered before she had accomplished whatever purpose had motivated her to abandon the festivities that had been planned around her presence as bride and hostess. The route that Clara chose for her departure from the house took her through areas of the farmstead that were not illuminated by the lanterns that had been positioned to guide guests, moving between different areas of celebration, creating opportunities for unobserved movement while also exposing her to potential dangers that were not typically encountered by young women wearing formal attire and moving without the protection of male escorts through territory that could be hazardous even during daylight hours. The darkness that surrounded the outbuildings where farm equipment and stored crops created obstacles and hiding places also provided concealment for activities that might not bear scrutiny from potential witnesses who possessed knowledge of family business practices and legal arrangements. The smokehouse that served as Clara's apparent destination stood approximately 50 yards from the main house, positioned to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns that would carry smoke away from residential areas, while also providing convenient access to the root cellar where meat preservation activities were conducted according to methods that had been refined through generations of Ozark families who had learned to maximize the value of livestock through careful attention to curing and storage. Techniques that could provide protein throughout the year, regardless of seasonal variations in availability of fresh meat. But the smokehouse and its associated underground storage facilities also served functions within the Whitaker family's operations that extended beyond simple food preservation into territories that involved the management of family assets and the concealment of business activities that required privacy from potential observers who might not understand the complex relationships between agricultural prosperity and the political arrangements that enabled large landowners to maintain their positions despite changing economic conditions and increasing government regulation of rural enterprises. The construction of the root cellar that lay beneath the smokehouse reflected both practical requirements for food storage in climates where seasonal temperature variations could destroy preserved goods if proper environmental controls were not maintained, and security considerations that suggested the space was also used for purposes that required protection from unauthorized access or accidental discovery. The walls had been built using limestone blocks that had been quarried from formations that outcropped throughout the region, while the ceiling consisted of heavy timber beams that could support substantial weight while also providing structural integrity that would resist both weather damage and deliberate attempts at forced entry. The entrance to the cellar was concealed beneath a wooden hatchway that appeared to be simply a functional access point for the movement of preserved goods between underground storage areas and the smokehouse where final preparation activities were conducted. But closer examination would have revealed that the hatchway was secured with locking mechanisms that exceeded what would have been necessary for simple food storage, while the positioning of the entrance provided privacy from casual observation, while also creating opportunities for activities that required concealment from potential witnesses who might be present in other areas of the farmstead. It was toward this concealed entrance that Clara directed her steps as she moved through the darkness that surrounded the farm buildings, her white wedding dress creating a ghostly figure that seemed to float between the shadows cast by structures whose familiar daytime appearance had been transformed by night into something approaching ominous presence. Her movement suggested knowledge of the terrain that came from years of childhood exploration of every corner of the family property, while her obvious familiarity with the location of obstacles and hazards indicated that this nighttime journey was not her first venture into areas of the farmstead that were not normally visited by family members whose responsibilities focused on household management rather than agricultural operations. The discovery of Clara's hairpin near the cellar entrance would later provide the first concrete evidence that her disappearance had been connected to activities that had taken place in proximity to the underground storage facility. But the positioning of this small personal item suggested that it had been dropped or torn from her hair during circumstances that involved struggle or resistance rather than voluntary removal during normal grooming activities. The bent condition of the metal indicated that substantial force had been applied during whatever events had resulted in its separation from Clara's carefully arranged wedding hairstyle. While its location near the concealed entrance to the cellar provided clear indication that Clara had indeed reached her apparent destination, despite the hazards and obstacles that had complicated her journey through the darkness. But perhaps most significantly, the condition of the ground surrounding the cellar entrance showed clear evidence of recent disturbance that extended far beyond what would have been expected from normal access to food storage facilities during the period when wedding preparations were being conducted. The earth had been disturbed and tamped flat with the kind of systematic attention that suggested deliberate concealment of activities that required elimination of visible traces, while the presence of damp mortar on the stones that surrounded the entrance indicated recent masonry work that seemed inconsistent with routine maintenance of food storage facilities. The sounds that began to emerge from beneath the smokehouse during the hours following Clara's disappearance created additional evidence that activities were being conducted in the underground storage areas that exceeded the normal functions of food preservation and involved circumstances that required concealment from potential witnesses who might be present elsewhere on the farmstead. These sounds, which included what appeared to be human voices engaged in conversation or distress, along with the noise associated with construction activities involving the movement of heavy materials and the use of tools that would not normally be employed in food storage operations. The hymn that could be heard faintly through the boards that covered the cellar entrance provided the most disturbing evidence of Clara's presence in the underground facility and the nature of the circumstances that had led to her confinement in spaces that had been designed for food storage rather than human habitation. The melody that drifted upward through gaps in the wooden covering was recognizable as one of the gospel songs that had been performed earlier in the evening during the wedding ceremony. But its presentation in Clara's voice, muffled by intervening barriers and distorted by the acoustic properties of the confined space, created an effect that was more haunting than inspiring. Dawn crept across the Taney County ridges like a reluctant witness to the previous night's revelries, its pale light filtering through the morning mist that clung to the hollows and creek bottoms where cool air had settled during the brief hours when summer heat had finally released its grip on the Ozark landscape. The roosters that crowed from farmsteads scattered across the rolling hills proclaimed the arrival of another day in voices that seemed unusually subdued, as if even the livestock sensed that something had gone wrong with the natural order of things during the dark hours when most God-fearing folk should have been sleeping peacefully in their beds after offering proper thanks for the blessings that had marked Clara Whitaker's wedding celebration. Sheriff Jasper Moody arrived at the Whitaker farmstead shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, his horse picking its way carefully along the rutted lane that connected the main road to the cluster of buildings where evidence of the previous evening's festivities remained scattered across the farmyard in the form of discarded decorations, overturned chairs, and the general disarray that typically marked the aftermath of large social gatherings in rural communities where cleanup activities were postponed until daylight could reveal the full extent of restoration work that would be required to return the property to its normal appearance. The sheriff himself presented the appearance of a man who had been roused from bed earlier than his usual schedule would have demanded, his clothing showing signs of hasty dressing, while his demeanor reflected the kind of reluctant attention to duty that marked public officials whose enthusiasm for law enforcement was tempered by practical considerations related to maintaining favorable relationships with influential families whose support could determine the success or failure of political careers in counties where populations remained small enough that personal connections often mattered more than abstract principles of justice and legal procedure. Moody's reputation throughout Taney County reflected the complex realities of law enforcement in rural regions where the nearest circuit judge might be days away from any given location and where the practical authority of local officials depended more on community acceptance than on formal legal powers that could be difficult to exercise without adequate resources for investigation, prosecution, and punishment of individuals whose crimes might require intervention from outside agencies, whose jurisdiction and competence were not always clearly defined or readily available when emergency situations demanded immediate response. The sheriff's initial conversation with Joshua Whitaker took place on the front porch of the farmhouse, where the two men could speak privately while also maintaining the kind of respectful distance that characterized interactions between individuals whose relationship combined personal familiarity with professional obligations that might create conflicts of interest if not handled with appropriate diplomatic sensitivity. Joshua's explanation of Clara's disappearance emphasized the family's concern about her welfare, while also suggesting that her absence might be attributed to temporary emotional distress that had prompted her to seek privacy in locations where she could recover her composure without drawing unwanted attention from wedding guests who might not understand the pressures that could affect young women during major life transitions. But Sheriff Moody, despite his generally accommodating approach to law enforcement matters that involved prominent community families, possessed sufficient experience with missing person investigations to recognize that Joshua's account of Clara's disappearance contained elements that seemed inconsistent with normal patterns of behavior that might be expected from brides who were experiencing ordinary premarital anxieties or temporary overwhelm from wedding celebration activities. The timing of Clara's absence, which had occurred during the height of festivities rather than during quieter periods when emotional stress might have been more understandable, suggested circumstances that extended beyond simple need for solitude or recovery from social overstimulation. More significantly, the sheriff's preliminary examination of the areas around the farmhouse where Clara had been last seen revealed physical evidence that seemed inconsistent with voluntary departure from wedding activities for purposes of seeking private reflection or emotional recovery. The bent hairpin that had been discovered near the smokehouse cellar suggested struggle or resistance, rather than deliberate removal during normal grooming activities. While the condition of the ground around the cellar entrance showed signs of recent disturbance, that exceeded what would have been expected from routine access to food storage facilities during the period when wedding preparations were being conducted. The damp mortar that Sheriff Moody observed on the stones surrounding the cellar entrance created additional cause for concern about the circumstances that had led to Clara's disappearance, as the presence of recently applied masonry materials suggested construction activities that seemed inappropriate for the time period immediately following a wedding celebration when family attention should have been focused on hospitality and social obligations, rather than building projects that would require privacy from potential observers who might question the necessity for such work during festive occasions. But perhaps most disturbing from the perspective of criminal investigation was the sheriff's recognition that his ability to conduct comprehensive inquiry into Clara's fate was severely limited by political and economic relationships that connected his office to the Whitaker family through networks of mutual obligation and financial dependency that made aggressive law enforcement activities potentially dangerous to his own career prospects and community standing. The loans that had enabled him to purchase the property where he lived with his own family had been arranged through banks that maintained close business relationships with the Whitakers, while his political support during previous elections had depended heavily on endorsements from community leaders whose continued friendship required careful attention to their interests and sensitivities. The conversation that took place between Sheriff Moody and Martha Whitaker illustrated the complex dynamics that governed law enforcement activities in communities where social hierarchies based on wealth and family connections could override formal legal procedures when investigating crimes that involve prominent individuals whose prosecution might create economic disruption or social instability that could affect the welfare of numerous families whose livelihoods depended on maintaining favorable relationships with established business enterprises and agricultural operations. Martha's demeanor during this interview reflected the kind of composed authority that enabled certain individuals to shape the direction of official investigations through subtle expressions of expectation and implied consequences rather than direct threats or overt attempts to obstruct justice. Her responses to the sheriff's questions about Clara's disappearance were carefully calibrated to provide information that seemed cooperative while actually limiting the scope of inquiry to areas that would not threaten family interests or reveal information about business activities that required protection from outside scrutiny. The matriarch's references to Clara's previous expressions of anxiety about marriage and her suggestions that the young woman might have experienced temporary emotional crisis that prompted flight from family responsibilities were delivered with the kind of persuasive conviction that could influence official conclusions about criminal investigations while also providing plausible explanations that would satisfy community expectations about proper resolution of missing person cases involving respectable families whose reputations required protection from scandal or public controversy. But Sheriff Moody's experience with human behavior during crisis situations enabled him to recognize that Martha's explanations, despite their surface plausibility, contained subtle inconsistencies that suggested deliberate deception designed to deflect investigative attention from circumstances that the family preferred to keep private. The timing and manner of Martha's voluntary disclosure of information about Clara's supposed emotional problems seemed calculated to establish an alternative narrative that would make further investigation seem unnecessary, while her obvious knowledge of details about Clara's recent behavior suggested advanced preparation for conversations with law enforcement officials. The patriarch's contribution to the family's official account of Clara's disappearance involved extensive quotations from biblical passages that seemed designed to establish religious authority for conclusions about divine providence and human responsibility that would discourage secular investigation into matters that might be better understood through spiritual rather than legal frameworks. Joshua's invocation of scriptural principles related to women's roles in marriage and family relationships created theological justification for accepting Clara's absence as evidence of moral failure rather than criminal activity, while his references to divine judgment and heavenly justice implied that earthly authorities should not interfere with spiritual processes that exceeded human understanding. The systematic nature of these religious explanations suggested careful preparation designed to provide alternative interpretive frameworks that would make continued investigation seem inappropriate or even blasphemous. While the patriarch's obvious familiarity with legal language and procedure indicated knowledge of how religious arguments could be employed to limit the scope of official inquiry into family matters that involved complex financial arrangements and property relationships that might not withstand detailed scrutiny by outside authorities. The neighbors, who had been present during the wedding celebration, provided testimony that seemed to support the family's account of Clara's disappearance, while also revealing their own reluctance to offer information that might contradict explanations provided by individuals whose economic influence could affect their access to credit, employment, and market opportunities that were essential for agricultural success in regions where farming families depended on cooperative relationships for survival during difficult seasons or emergency situations that required community assistance. The pattern of witness testimony reflected the complex web of obligations and dependencies that characterized rural social organization, where formal legal procedures competed with informal systems of mutual support and protection that had evolved to serve community needs that extended beyond simple law enforcement into territories involving economic stability, social harmony, and collective security against external threats that could affect the welfare of entire regions, if not managed through careful attention to maintaining unity and solidarity among established families. The most significant limitation on Sheriff Moody's investigation was his recognition that aggressive pursuit of evidence related to Clara's disappearance could create consequences that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of a single missing person case into areas involving family business relationships, political alliances, and economic arrangements that affected the livelihoods of numerous individuals whose welfare depended on maintaining the kind of social stability that required avoiding public controversies that might damage community reputation or create external scrutiny of local affairs. The debt relationships that connected the sheriff's own financial obligations to business enterprises, controlled or influenced by the Whitaker family, created direct conflicts of interest that made objective law enforcement extremely difficult. While his political survival depended on maintaining favorable relationships with voters, whose economic interests were often aligned with those of prominent families, whose support was essential for successful campaigns in counties where personal connections and family loyalties could determine election outcomes more effectively than abstract principles of justice or legal procedure. The decision to conclude the investigation without filing criminal charges or pursuing further inquiry into the physical evidence that suggested foul play was presented as recognition that Clara's disappearance represented private family matter that should be resolved through spiritual guidance and community support, rather than formal legal proceedings that might create unnecessary publicity and social disruption without producing results that would serve the interests of justice or community welfare. But Sheriff Moody's final report on the case filed with county authorities several weeks after Clara's disappearance, contained subtle references to unresolved questions and unexplained evidence that suggested his own awareness that the official conclusions about her fate were based more on political expedience than factual investigation. While his recommendations for future handling of similar cases included suggestions for expanded investigative resources and external oversight that indicated recognition of the limitations that local political relationships could impose on effective law enforcement in communities where economic power and social influence could override formal legal authority. The decades that followed Clara Whitaker's wedding night disappearance settled over Taney County like layers of sediment in the creek bottoms, each year adding another stratum to the accumulating weight of silence that pressed down upon the communities scattered across the ridges and hollows, where families had learned to measure their words as carefully as they measured their grain, and to understand that some knowledge was too dangerous to share beyond the boundaries of kinship and mutual obligation that had evolved to protect neighbors. From the consequences of knowing too much about activities that required concealment from outside scrutiny, the drought that arrived in the summer of 1924 brought with it the kind of relentless heat that transformed the Ozark landscape from its customary green abundance into a parched tableau of brown grass and dust-laden air, where even the deep springs that had sustained settlement since the earliest days of frontier expansion began to fail, and families found themselves traveling increasingly long distances to secure the water necessary for basic survival during months when the skies seemed to have forgotten how to release the moisture that accumulated in clouds that promised relief, but delivered only empty wind and the mocking rumble of thunder that announced storms that never came. It was during this season of desperate need that young Thomas Whitaker, Clara's grandnephew and the last male heir to bear the family name after generations of marriages, deaths, and departures, had reduced the once prominent bloodline to a handful of individuals whose connection to the substantial landholdings that had once made the Whitaker name synonymous with prosperity and influence had become increasingly tenuous as inheritance laws and changing economic conditions had dispersed family assets among distant relatives and outside interests who lacked both the knowledge and the motivation necessary to maintain the agricultural enterprises that had sustained the family's prominence for decades. Thomas had been born into circumstances that bore little resemblance to the wealth and social position that had characterized earlier generations of Whitakers, his childhood shaped by the reduced expectations and limited opportunities that marked families whose fortunes had declined from abundance to modest respectability during the economic upheavals that had followed the end of the Great War and the subsequent agricultural depression that had affected rural communities throughout Missouri and Arkansas. His education had been limited to the lessons provided by the one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered farming families in his portion of the county, while his practical knowledge of agricultural matters had been acquired through participation in the increasingly difficult work of maintaining crops and livestock on land that no longer produced the reliable profits that had supported previous generations. The discovery that would transform Thomas from obscure descendant into reluctant guardian of family secrets occurred during his desperate search for preserved foods that might have been overlooked in the various storage facilities that dotted the property where the Whitaker homestead had once stood before fire, neglect, and the gradual abandonment of agricultural activities had reduced the impressive collection of farm buildings to scattered foundations and the few structures that remained sufficiently intact to serve as shelter for the livestock and equipment that represented the last remnants of what had once been one of Taney County's most successful farming operations. The root cellar beneath the smokehouse had not been opened for nearly a decade, its entrance sealed with debris and overgrowth that had accumulated during the years when changing economic conditions and the departure of family members for opportunities in cities and industrial regions had left the property without the constant attention that agricultural enterprises required for successful maintenance. The wooden hatchway that provided access to the underground storage chambers had warped and settled under the weight of seasons that had brought alternating cycles of rain and drought, while the metal hinges that had once made opening and closing a simple matter had corroded to the point where substantial effort would be required to gain entry to spaces that might contain the preserved foods that Thomas hoped could supplement his family's increasingly meager diet. The process of clearing away the accumulated debris and vegetation that concealed the cellar entrance revealed the first indications that the underground chambers might contain materials that extended beyond simple food storage into territories that involved family history and personal possessions that had been placed in secure locations for reasons that were not immediately apparent from the surface evidence. The stones that surrounded the entrance showed signs of modification that suggested deliberate concealment rather than natural weathering, while the presence of metal reinforcement materials and specialized masonry work indicated construction activities that had been conducted according to principles that emphasized security and permanence rather than simple utility. But it was the discovery of the second wall, revealed only when Thomas had pried loose several of the limestone blocks that formed what he had initially assumed to be the back boundary of the storage chamber, that transformed his search for preserved food into an exploration of family secrets that had been hidden beneath layers of stone and mortar for nearly 2 decades. The space that opened beyond this concealed barrier contained not the additional storage area that might have been expected from architectural modifications designed to expand food preservation capacity, but rather a carefully prepared repository that seemed designed to preserve materials that required protection from both environmental damage and unauthorized access by individuals who lacked knowledge of the chamber's existence. The hope chest that occupied the center of this hidden space represented the kind of elaborate wooden furniture that had been crafted by skilled artisans for families whose prosperity enabled them to commission pieces that combined practical utility with decorative artistry that reflected both personal taste and social ambition. The chest itself had been constructed from walnut timber that had been harvested from the massive trees that had once dominated the forest landscape before agricultural expansion had required their removal, while the brass hardware and decorative inlays showed the attention to detail that marked furniture, created for individuals who expected their possessions to serve not only practical functions, but also to communicate information about their wealth and social position to visitors whose opinions could influence family reputation and business relationships. But the contents of the hope chest revealed that its placement in the concealed chamber had been motivated by purposes that extended far beyond simple storage of valuable household goods or family heirlooms that required protection from theft or environmental damage. The wedding dress that lay carefully folded within the chest's interior was immediately recognizable as the garment that Clara had worn during the celebration that had marked the last time she had been seen by any living person whose testimony could be trusted by individuals who might question the official explanations that had been provided to account for her mysterious disappearance. The condition of the dress provided disturbing evidence about the circumstances that had led to its removal from Clara's person and its subsequent concealment in the underground chamber where it had remained undisturbed for decades, while family members and community residents had accepted explanations that attributed her absence to voluntary departure or tragic accident rather than criminal activity that required systematic concealment of physical evidence. The fabric showed signs of violent removal that were inconsistent with normal undressing procedures, while the presence of bloodstains on areas that should not have been affected by ordinary wedding activities suggested injury that had occurred during struggle or resistance. The pearl comb that had secured Clara's wedding hairstyle provided additional confirmation that her disappearance had involved circumstances that required the systematic removal and concealment of personal effects that might have provided evidence about her fate if discovered by individuals who possessed knowledge of criminal investigation procedures or sufficient social influence to demand official inquiry into activities that the family preferred to keep private. The positioning of the comb within the hope chest suggested careful arrangement rather than hasty concealment, while its undamaged condition indicated that it had been removed from Clara's hair through deliberate action rather than accidental loss during normal activities. But perhaps most significantly, the wedding ring that Thomas discovered wrapped in silk fabric within the deepest compartment of the hope chest bore engravings that matched entries in family ledgers that documented Clara's engagement to Elias Carter and the financial arrangements that had been established to govern the transfer of property rights that would have occurred if the marriage had achieved legal completion through consummation and the establishment of a household that could have produced legitimate heirs with claims to Whitaker family assets. The presence of the ring in the concealed chamber provided conclusive evidence that Clara's disappearance had been accomplished through methods that had prevented the marriage from achieving the legal status that would have transferred substantial portions of family wealth to individuals whose interests might not have aligned with those of established family members who possessed reasons for preventing such transfers. The systematic nature of the evidence concealment suggested advanced planning and careful execution by individuals who understood both the legal implications of Clara's marriage and the investigative procedures that would be employed if her disappearance attracted official attention. But the most disturbing discovery within the hidden chamber was the pattern of claw marks that covered the interior walls of the space where Clara's personal effects had been stored. Marks that could only have been created by human fingernails during desperate attempts to escape from confinement in conditions that would have made survival impossible, despite prolonged periods of consciousness during which the victim would have experienced the gradual consumption of available oxygen while understanding with terrible clarity that rescue was impossible and death was inevitable. The positioning and depth of these marks indicated that Clara had survived for substantial periods after being sealed within the chamber, her attempts to escape becoming increasingly frantic as physical exhaustion and oxygen deprivation reduced her strength, while also creating the psychological desperation that characterized individuals who understood that they were experiencing the final phases of their existence under circumstances that involved systematic cruelty designed to maximize suffering while ensuring that evidence of criminal activity would remain concealed from potential discovery. The spacing and pattern of the claw marks suggested that Clara had attempted to dig through solid limestone using only her fingernails, a task that would have been physically impossible even under optimal conditions, but which represented the kind of desperate activity that marked individuals whose psychological state had been reduced to pure survival instinct that overrode rational assessment of practical limitations. The presence of dried blood on the stone surfaces confirmed that these escape attempts had continued, even after her fingernails had been torn away, and her fingers had been reduced to bleeding flesh that left traces of her final struggles embedded in the rock that had served as both prison and tomb. Thomas's discovery of this evidence created immediate recognition that he had uncovered proof of criminal activities that exceeded anything that community folklore had suggested about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Clara's disappearance, while also making him the unwitting inheritor of knowledge that could expose family members to prosecution for murders that had occurred decades earlier, but which remained subject to legal action if sufficient evidence could be assembled to support formal charges against surviving participants in the conspiracy. The decision of what to do with this evidence presented Thomas with moral and practical dilemmas that reflected the complex relationships between justice, family loyalty, and community stability that had governed responses to criminal activity in regions where formal law enforcement remained limited and where social harmony often depended on maintaining silence about activities that could disrupt established relationships if subjected to official scrutiny or public discussion. The revelation of Clara's tomb beneath the smokehouse floor marked not the conclusion, but the beginning of a transformation that would gradually consume the Whitaker family name like a slow-burning fire, reducing what had once been among Taney County's most respected lineages to whispered folklore and cautionary tales told in hushed voices around farmhouse tables where neighbors gathered during the long winter evenings when isolation made every creak of settling timber sound like footsteps of the restless dead seeking acknowledgement of wrongs that had never been properly redressed through earthly justice or spiritual reconciliation. Thomas Whitaker's decision to reseal the hidden chamber without reporting his discovery to authorities reflected the complex calculations that governed moral choice in communities where family loyalty competed with abstract principles of justice, and where the practical consequences of exposing criminal activity that had occurred decades earlier might create more harm than healing for individuals whose lives had been shaped by circumstances beyond their control. The knowledge he now possessed about Clara's fate created obligations that extended beyond his personal comfort or safety into territories where his choices could affect the welfare of distant relatives, community relationships, and the historical memory that would determine how future generations understood their heritage. But the act of concealing evidence of murder, however well-intentioned, seemed to activate forces that had been dormant during the years when Clara's tomb had remained undiscovered, and her fate had been attributed to mystery rather than acknowledged crime. The limestone blocks that Thomas carefully repositioned to recreate the appearance of ordinary storage space somehow failed to contain the spiritual disturbance that his discovery had released, as if the very act of witnessing Clara's final resting place had broken barriers that had previously prevented her restless spirit from influencing events in the world of the living. The first indication that the Whitaker family had become subject to supernatural retribution came during the wedding of Thomas's sister, Martha, to Samuel Hayes, a neighboring farmer whose courtship had proceeded according to conventional patterns of rural romance, and whose character and prospects had satisfied the modest expectations that marked families whose social ambitions had been reduced by economic circumstances and the gradual erosion of status that had accompanied their decline from prosperity to respectability. The ceremony itself had been planned as a simple celebration that would acknowledge the union without creating financial burdens that could strain resources that were already stretched by the demands of maintaining agricultural operations during difficult economic conditions. The morning of Martha's wedding dawned with weather that seemed ideal for outdoor celebration. Clear skies and gentle breezes that would make the planned festivities comfortable for guests who would be traveling from throughout the county to witness vows that would be exchanged beneath the oak trees that had sheltered Whitaker family gatherings for generations. But as the appointed hour approached, atmospheric conditions began to change with a rapidity that seemed to violate natural laws governing weather patterns in regions where climatic transitions typically occurred gradually and according to seasonal rhythms that could be predicted by farmers whose livelihoods depended on understanding environmental conditions. The thunderclouds that gathered above the ridge where the ceremony was to take place seemed to materialize from clear sky with impossible speed. their dark masses accumulating and spreading until they blocked sunlight and created an atmosphere of impending doom that made wedding guests increasingly nervous about remaining in exposed locations where lightning strikes could prove fatal to individuals who lacked adequate shelter from electrical storms that could develop without warning during Missouri's volatile summer weather patterns. But it was not merely the sudden arrival of dangerous weather that created unease among the wedding party and assembled guests. The lightning that began to strike with increasing frequency seemed to demonstrate targeting that exceeded what could be attributed to normal electrical phenomena, focusing its energy on structures and locations that were associated with wedding preparations, rather than selecting the highest points or most conductive materials that typically attracted electrical discharge during ordinary thunderstorms. The barn that had been decorated for the wedding reception was struck by lightning 7 times during the space of 15 minutes, each bolt creating fires that were immediately extinguished by rain that fell only on the burning areas while leaving other portions of the structure completely dry. The wedding cake that had been positioned on tables beneath the oak trees was destroyed by a lightning strike that split the ancient trunk and scattered burning branches across the carefully arranged refreshments, while leaving human beings who stood only yards away completely unharmed by electrical energy that seemed to possess intelligence and intention that natural forces should not have demonstrated. Most disturbing was the lightning strike that occurred at the precise moment when Martha and Samuel were attempting to exchange wedding rings. The electrical discharge striking the ground directly between them with such force that it knocked both participants unconscious while creating a crater that revealed underlying limestone formations identical to those that had been used to construct Clara's tomb beneath the smokehouse. The rings themselves were fused together by the intense heat generated by the lightning strike, creating a twisted mass of metal that could not be separated, despite efforts by blacksmiths whose skills had been acquired through decades of working with materials under high-temperature conditions. Samuel Hayes, whose courtship of Martha had been characterized by the steady devotion and practical planning that marked successful farmers whose marriages were based on realistic assessment of mutual compatibility and shared commitment to agricultural enterprise, found himself unable to complete the wedding ceremony despite his obvious desire to formalize their union and begin the married life they had planned together. His attempts to speak the wedding vows were interrupted by a paralysis that seemed to affect his vocal cords whenever he attempted to pronounce Martha's name, while his efforts to place the replacement ring that had been borrowed from family members were frustrated by a trembling in his hands that made precise movement impossible despite his normal manual dexterity. The failure of Martha's wedding to achieve completion was attributed by most observers to the extreme weather conditions that had made outdoor ceremony dangerous and uncomfortable. But those who possessed knowledge of Clara's fate recognized patterns that suggested supernatural intervention, designed to prevent marriages that might have diluted Whitaker family blood through union with individuals who lacked connection to the crimes that had established the foundation for whatever curse had been activated by Thomas's discovery of evidence that documented systematic murder, conducted for purposes of preserving family wealth and social position. The supernatural disruption of Whitaker family weddings continued across subsequent generations. Each attempted marriage encountering obstacles that seemed designed to prevent the completion of unions that might have provided opportunities for spiritual cleansing through the introduction of innocent blood and moral renovation that could have broken the cycle of retribution that had been initiated by Clara's murder and sustained by the community's complicity in concealing crimes that required acknowledgement and proper punishment before healing could occur. Robert Whitaker's attempt to marry Elizabeth Morrison was frustrated when the church where the ceremony was scheduled to take place was struck by lightning during the rehearsal, creating a fire that destroyed not only the building, but also the county records that documented births, deaths, and marriages for the previous 30 years. The loss of these official documents created legal complications that made it impossible to verify the eligibility of either party for marriage, while also eliminating historical records that might have provided evidence about Clara's disappearance and the circumstances that had led to her elimination by family members whose crimes had never been officially investigated or prosecuted. James Whitaker's wedding was interrupted by the collapse of the floor beneath the altar where he and his bride were standing, the wooden planks giving way to reveal a sinkhole that exposed limestone caverns identical to those where Clara's body had been discovered decades earlier. The bride, Margaret Collins, sustained injuries during her fall into the cavern that left her unable to speak coherently about her experience underground. Her subsequent testimony, consisting only of repeated references to the woman in white, who had warned her about dangers that awaited brides who married into families whose wealth had been built upon systematic murder and whose continuation depended on maintaining silence about crimes that had never been properly redressed. The pattern of supernatural intervention in Whitaker family marriages created recognition throughout the county that the family had become subject to divine justice that exceeded the limitations of earthly legal systems, while also serving as warning to potential marriage partners whose union with Whitaker descendants might expose them to retribution that was designed to punish not only direct participants in criminal activity, but also individuals whose association with the family might be interpreted as endorsement of actions that had violated fundamental moral principles governing relationships between human beings and divine authority. The gradual extinction of the Whitaker family name through failed marriages, premature deaths, and departures to distant regions where family history was unknown represented the working out of justice that operated according to principles that exceeded human understanding, but which seemed designed to ensure that crimes committed in darkness would eventually be brought to light through the elimination of bloodlines that had benefited from systematic murder and the community silence that had enabled such activities to continue without legal consequences or social condemnation. The farmhouse that had once stood as monument to Whitaker prosperity and social position began to deteriorate with supernatural rapidity following the discovery of Clara's remains, its structural integrity failing despite construction techniques that should have ensured stability for centuries under normal environmental conditions. The foundation stones that had been quarried from the same limestone formations that had been used to construct Clara's tomb began to shift and crack, creating instability that made the building unsafe for human habitation, while also producing sounds that residents described as resembling human voices engaged in conversation or lamentation. The most persistent of these sounds was identified by listeners as a woman's voice singing gospel hymns, the melodies corresponding to songs that had been performed during Clara's wedding celebration, but presented with lyrics that had been modified to reference themes of divine judgment, earthly retribution, and the ultimate inability of human wealth or social position to provide protection from spiritual consequences of systematic evil conducted for purposes of material gain. The roof cellar, where Clara's body had been discovered, became the focal point for supernatural phenomena that attracted visitors from throughout Missouri and Arkansas. Individuals whose interest in the paranormal or whose spiritual beliefs led them to seek contact with restless spirits whose earthly sufferings required acknowledgement and prayer for proper resolution. But these pilgrims often reported experiences that exceeded their expectations about ghostly manifestations. encountering environmental conditions that seemed to recreate Clara's final hours through sensations of confinement, oxygen deprivation, and the desperation that characterized individuals who understood they were experiencing the gradual approach of death under circumstances that involved systematic cruelty. The Ozark Hills themselves seemed to retain memory of Clara's murder, with local residents reporting that storms often produced atmospheric disturbances that created sounds resembling human screams or pleas for help. While travelers who passed through the region during certain weather conditions claimed to observe lights moving through the forest that suggested the presence of individuals carrying lanterns or torches, despite the absence of any human explanation for such phenomena. The folklore that developed around the cursed Whitaker wedding provided the community with frameworks for understanding criminal behavior and divine justice that drew upon both Christian theology and older spiritual traditions that had been preserved through oral transmission across generations of residents whose understanding of relationships between earthly actions and supernatural consequences had been shaped by cultural influences that predated European settlement and reflected indigenous knowledge systems that recognized connections between human moral choices and environmental responses that could affect entire regions for extended periods of time.